Hello, this is Sasa, and this is a sewing tutorial on how I made Asagiri Gen, the mentalist from Dr. Stone, his cosplay. I have a separate video on how I made the cola bottle label. For the pants, it's a basic leggings pattern, and I cut it extra long so that I could bunch it up around my ankles and my knees. So you take the pants and you fold it in half. First, you're going to sew the inner leg seam, and then second, you're going to sew the crotch together. The fabric I'm using is a slightly stretched suede fabric. I tried to pick fabrics that would make sense in the world that they're living in. I hemmed the top and put elastic in the waistband. And now to make the inner kimono top, I made mine sleeveless. So this is the basic pattern. I don't want any seam at the shoulder, so it's a very long rectangle. And the place where I wrote neck, that's where you fold that in half, and that will be where your shoulder and your arm goes through. So that's the numbers that I used. So the first thing is to sew the center back seam. And I wanted a slit, so I didn't sew all the way to the bottom. And next you would to hem the slit. Since this fabric frays easily, I use the pinking shears when I cut it. So pinking shears gives that little zigzag stitch that helps to stop the fraying. So after the slit, I'm going to finish the center back seam. If you do not have a serger, you can use a zigzag stitch. So I'm attaching inner ribbon ties, and this keeps the coat from opening. I also put slits on the two side seams. For the collar, you want to use fusible interfacing to help it have that stiffness. You can use clips instead of pins to help hold things together. So I'm using the clips for the collar here. After I finish serging the collar, I'll top stitch it. I found this rope at the dollar store and I got 2 packs of them because it wraps around his waist twice, then a third time it ties in a bow. And since it's not long enough, I'm going to attach the 2 pieces of rope together. I have a polyester ribbon to cover the joint, and I melted the ends so there will be no fraying. I'm just using regular tacky glue. It's also from the dollar store. And then using some thread to reinforce it, I'm sewing the 2 ends together. This join will be at the center back, and since he wears his jacket, you won't be able to see the join. You don't have to wait for the glue to dry on the first step. You can attach the ribbon to cover it up. So I use more glue, and then I'm going to sew again. If you can find rope that's long enough, you won't have to do any joins. If it's too thick and you have difficulty hand sewing, you can use pliers to help push the needle through. So this is the obi pattern. I have the fabric, I have thick interfacing, I have a little bit of padding, more interfacing, and then the other fabric. I did this because I didn't want it to have that flat look. I wanted to have some kind of thickness to it. So one of the pieces has fusible interfacing, so I ironed that one on first. Trying to attach 4 or 5 layers together all at one shot is rather difficult, so you do it in steps. First you attach 2 layers and then the third layer. And I'm only putting the thick part in the front center of the stomach. At the back, there's no need to make it so puffy. So his obi has frayed and jagged edges. So to recreate that look, instead of sewing straight, I'm going to sew all wiggly. So I did a test on a scrap piece of fabric to see if it would work first. So I'm just marking the seam allowance. Then I'm going to be drawing a squiggly line as a guideline of how I want to sew it. So after sewing, you'll need to clip and trim any extra fabric. And then flip it right side out. And you can use a stick or a chopstick to help push out, but be careful not to push too hard or else you can create holes. I still use my stick to push it while I iron it. And one end is open, so I fold that under and I'll iron that, and afterwards I'll sew it closed. You're going to want to try it on to figure out where you want to sew the velcro on. The outer coat, the obi, and the inner kimono, I found all these fabrics in the drapery section, so that's where they sell the stuff to make curtains. For his outer jacket, I really wanted something thick and with texture. There's no collar for the jacket, so to do the hem around the neckline, I folded over twice and I sewed it. It's important to get the exact thread color for this. Because there's no lining and I don't want any stitching to be shown because his jacket moves around and you can see the inside, I'm going to be doing French seams. So first it's wrong sides together and I'm going to stop around 2.5 inches where the arm opening is supposed to be. And my seam allowance is really small, it's about the edge of my presser foot. Since this fabric is really thick, it helps to iron it. And then now with the right sides together, you're going to sew and you're going to hide the raw edges that you did on the first step. The sleeve seam on the bottom will also be a French seam. So I already did that, and then we're just going to hem the sleeve opening. So I fold it over twice and then you sew. So now you're ready to attach the sleeve. You put the right sides together and you sew it around. After I finished sewing it with my sewing machine, I finished off the edges so there's no more fraying with my serger. I use ribbon for the black line because it's nice and straight and it's fast. If you want, you can also use paint. So for his inner collar, I'm making it a fake collar, and these are the buttons I found for it. So I want the collar to be very stiff, so I'm using interfacing on the collar pieces. Since it's really thick, it's difficult to stab pins in it, so using clips is a better idea. So I want to fake that the collar is opening in the front. So I'm going to take right sides together of the front and we're going to sew inside the seam. So this will make it look like the front is attached. If this is too difficult to place in the machine, you can also do this by hand. Baste the bottom of the collar together before attaching it to the main body. I'm going to sew a very small seam in the center front to create a fake line. So this step you attach the collar and you want to make sure that the center is lined up. I'm using a thin lining, and this is because I don't want the fabric to be itchy against my skin. But this depends on your fabric choice, the lining is not necessary. Next you hand sew the buttons on. And finally you finish the bottom edge. I decided just to serge the outer edge instead of making it flipped right side out because then the fabric would be very thick and sewing the zipper would be very difficult with thick fabric. Next you attach your zipper. I'm using an invisible zipper, so you have to make sure that when it's open all the way that it can fit over your head because invisible zippers are non-separating. So I did a bunch of weathering tests with different kind of paint and water combinations, glue, and practicing with sandpaper of how hard you want to push on it. I used cheap acrylic paint from the dollar store. The first step is to cut, rough it up, paint, and then to stop it from continuing to fray, I used Fray Stop. So using my hands, I just rubbed the fabric back and forth and pulled out some extra threads. And also to help you, you can use sandpaper along the edges. I mixed some paint with some water. And I used brown paint for the inner kimono because it's a lighter color. I tried it with the black paint, but it looked too dark and harsh. I did more than one coat. The first coat had more water in it, so it was of a lighter color. And then afterwards, I did a darker color, so there was a nice fade effect. And since it's water, it gets absorbed by the fabric, but when it dries, it has a nice fade effect. So I used the paint without any water. I used my finger and I dabbed it on just the edges and any of the extra threads sticking out. I did the same painting for the purple outer coat, but instead of using brown paint, I used black paint since the fabric is darker. Please tag me if you use this tutorial so I can see your awesome work. And if you want to and can support me creating more free content, either purchase a coffee or buy something from my Etsy shop. Thank you for watching!